Welcome to Sustainability Now, solutions to shape a world that works. Designed for everyone interested in responsible stewardship of the planet, covering food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Scott Billy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sustainability Now. I'm Scott Billy, and today I'll be your host. And we're super excited to have David Leon from Farmers Footprint joining us today. He's the executive director and co-founder of the organization, and would love to learn some more about what y'all are up to.
Thanks for having me on, Scott. It's great to be here.
I guess let's get started with a little bit of background for any of our listeners who aren't familiar with Farmers Footprint. Just a little details about what the organization is and what you all are up to.
Yeah, happy to share. So Farmers Footprint is a nonprofit organization. Our main mission is to inspire, accelerate, and expand the use of regenerative agriculture practices around the world. And we focus a lot on what are the methodologies and ways we can bring about a more regenerative world. And by that, I mean build in deeper relationship with land and one another. I really understand regeneration to mean relationship. And some of the ways we explore that started through the soil. And so the organization really was founded on a kernel of a story. My co-founder is a gentleman named Dr. Zach Bush, and he got really interested through a history in academic cancer therapies research and also as a clinical physician around some of the things he was seeing in his patients in response to some of the diet regimens that he was recommending for them. Putting them on plant-based diets and seeing inflammation markers in the body go up was sort of an unexpected result for him. And that got him interested in, what was going on with the food itself. And he started looking at food production. And so around 2018, he endeavored to go and look at agricultural production methods across the Mississippi River system with a particular emphasis on what was going on with some of the agricultural inputs, and specifically one of the most widely used herbicides and pesticides, one of them being glyphosate, which is otherwise known in its trade name as Roundup. That's pretty much the most ubiquitous chemical in use today in agriculture worldwide. And it's starting, to be better understood and well documented that it's found almost in everything now. It's a massive, massive amount of this chemical in use. And that really came about because of, the advent of GMO crops, which allowed for this, what was once a spot treatment because it pretty much kills anything it touches, when they were able to modify crops to be what they called Roundup ready, where they would not be subject to some of Roundup's methodologies. They were able to spray it on everything without really any controls needed. And Zach really started to take a look at this chemical, which is carried in water, and particularly when you have soils that are biologically not biologically very active because you've killed a lot of the biology in that soil, you start to lose the connection of that soil, and it starts to erode. And so one of the big issues that we have in conventional agriculture is soil erosion. When you're not keeping a living root in the soil and you're also destroying the microbiology in that soil, it's going to tend to break apart. and that will wash off during, storm events or whatever, flood and the like. And now you're carrying this chemical through our river systems. And so Zach really wanted to take a look at that, and particularly was interested in the way that, well, how is this contributing to the giant dead zones that were forming in the Gulf of Mexico, which is the outlet of the Mississippi River system, and also the population level sort of health crisis that was happening in the southeast of the United States, which had been dubbed Cancer Alley for some time. And so we went further upstream, and we were seeing these conventional agriculture practices and the tributary systems of the Mississippi River system that were connecting all of these agricultural regions. And you basically had sort of a highway of chemical laden water moving down through the middle of the country and out into the Gulf of Mexico. And so we aspired to go out and do a documentary film on this. And in the course of doing that film, I think what really struck Zach was the human element, and particularly the farmers who were seeing those changes in their land over the last couple of decades and had decided to do something about it. And so the outcome was actually a very poetic film, and all due respect to an incredible director, Nicole Ragland, who directed and shot that film. It ended up being this human story about a farm family, the Breitkreutz family, that was sort of on the vanguard of what we now understand to be sort of regenerative transition on their land. And that film, when we launched it in February of 2019, that was really the kernel of what became Farmers Footprint. And storytelling particularly has been a big emphasis because we saw the power that film inspired. And this was really an invitation for people to come into closer relationship with their food system, to understand the hands that touch the food that we're all eating, that we're often, when we're buying food at a grocery store, we're very far away from understanding what goes into the food we eat. And understanding that there's sort of a massive imperative that we change our food production methods from one of, industrialized, mechanized agriculture that has been sort of the cornerstone of the way we do things for the last 60, 70 years, coming out of the Green Revolution. This, what I would call also a chemically dependent form of agriculture. You could draw a direct line to even a pharmaceutical metaphor, where, agronomists come onto your land and test your soil, and they prescribe medications for your land. And that's the way agriculture has been done by and large at mass scale in this country and in other countries. But it's not the way agriculture has always been done, and largely, drawing on indigenous land stewardship methods and other various methods that you see that have been more fringe efforts, biodynamic farming, and sort of maybe the precursors to what has become the organic certification, is a focus on living soil, and that has now come to be called regenerative agriculture. And that's what we're here to promote. We're here to promote a deeper sense of connection with our food system and the land and the people that steward that system.
That's great. Yeah, we had Dr. Zach on our podcast about 4 years ago or so. It was right when he was releasing his studies tying the glyphosate and the Mississippi River and the increased. I think his initial research was to try to figure out why so many people in southeastern United States were getting cancer. Like the map had turned itself upside down almost overnight, and he was really trying to come up with an answer to that. And really, when you see the overlay map of all the tributaries of the Mississippi and how they'll go through all the farmlands in the Midwest, it's sort of and unintended consequence of the actions there. It's really a steamroller effect where the effort is causing more erosion, like you mentioned earlier. I think I heard somewhere that the #1 export of the United States by accident is topsoil. Not something we want to export, but we are because of the farming practices. It's not staying on the land anymore. It's washing down. And because of the glyphosate being used as desiccant to wipe out the, well, not wipe out, but to totally dehydrate the grain crops all at once to make the harvest go quicker and more efficiently. It's just massive amounts of that stuff all washing in together.
Farmers certainly understand that too. When they start doing these regenerative practices, they're also seeing the need for chemical inputs actually be reduced. And so, that's where we can talk about the economic benefits of this, where you can actually lower your cost to produce the same amount of food and actually get a better product, because you're really feeding your soil and you're focused less on feeding the plant. And then you get all these happy consequences that come out of that. So glyphosate, just to pull back to that, it decimates that microbiology, and it's not even totally clear all the things that it's doing to us yet. Those studies are just starting to gain bigger attention. And obviously, when we launched the nonprofit in 2019, a bit of happy timing in terms of the content, but for kind of a sad reason, was these big lawsuits that actually had come through, and some major awards going against Monsanto, the primary producer of Roundup, and people were leaned in like, wow, there's people getting, there's hundreds of millions of dollars here in the balance for folks who have gotten really terrible cancers from constant exposure to these chemicals. And there's research Zach is doing and many others are doing. We're now seeing some of these consequences coming through, and oftentimes it's generations after even initial exposure. That's the way it's staying in our body. And the fundamental insight that really tied, and I think the power of having a human doctor talking about farming, was that these two things are intrinsically connected, that the microbiome in the soil and the microbiome in our gut are in deep relationship with one another, and they have been for probably the entire history of mankind, right? We've co-evolved with these microbial communities, and we need the food that we're eating to be feeding our healthy guts as well. And when we're eating stuff that is devoid of that, or even worse, has chemicals that are meant to destroy microbiology, you can only understand what those health consequences can start to become. And these are really difficult things. This is population level health correlations, and so I certainly leave that to the experts, and Zach is definitely the best person to speak to those things. But I think for everyone, we can kind of understand this at an instinctual level. Like we understand that these relationships are there, and so without understanding all the intricacies of the science, it can still make sense to us that if we're gonna introduce some chemicals that are gonna decimate those things, that's probably not a good idea. And the worst part about glyphosate is, and now we've found it in almost everything. It's almost impossible to avoid. Even if you're buying your produce from perfect biodynamic organic farms, this stuff travels through the air. It's sprayed, it's aerosolized, it's moving through water systems. They find glyphosate in breast milk. It's in almost every food that we eat. It's really hard to get completely clear of it unless you're living in a bubble. And for me, it's look, we're a part of this population level pharmaceutical experiment, essentially. that no one consented to. And are we okay with that? That's sort of an underlying piece of this, is like, we need to make a change. This is not okay in any sense of the word. And even if we found this thing to be, this synthetic chemical to be completely inert and safe, it's still problematic, the fact that it's everywhere. This is something that we've introduced the environment that it's going to be really hard to ever get rid of. And so we need to start making changes right away.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big challenges when you get into the scientific studies and all of that, most of our science and research is focused on like singular items in a vacuum almost, and really never takes into consideration how they all work together. We do have the microbiome living in the soil and in our guts. The human body has as many molecules and atoms that are non-human than human in it. And we need to respect that. And the fact that, there's a microcosm inside of us as well as the one that lives under the soil. And we need to make sure that we're always taking that into consideration when we're making our decisions. And when you get into that hyper scientific talk, it's really difficult to keep people's focus. And that's one of the things I really like about Farmers Footprint is you're not going too far down the rabbit hole into like, white papers and crazy dense topics. You're staying on the human level and telling the stories of people who are making a difference. And I really think that's a unique approach that you've taken, and a great one to really bring it home to people in a way that makes it easier to digest for the layperson.
I really appreciate that you say that. There's a couple points I would want to make. I mean, one, I am that person. I'm not a scientist myself. My background is an entrepreneur, and certainly, have a deep appreciation and caring for the natural world, and obviously my personal health, the health of my family and my communities. And I think that's all you need to start. You don't need to be a climate scientist or a doctor or a soil scientist. You need to actually find your place in that mosaic. And we all do have a role to play in this. And that ecology is, I think, one of the very profound teachings that I've come to understand from these farmers, and from studying the regenerative movement and the tenets of those and how we apply those to our everyday life. We are moving from this moment of what I would call taxonomy, which really underlied science for hundreds of years, right? Where we wanted to categorize everything, we want to name it, we want to put it into hierarchies and flow charts, and we want to say, this is life. And I think what regeneration is really trying to say is we need to move from that taxonomy mindset to an ecology mindset. We need to understand that actually the interaction between those things is what is really special. Not necessarily this thing or that thing. Nature puts all these species, within an environment, and not all of them make it. It's expressing an ecology, and some of those lead to dead ends, and some of them go on and continue to evolve. And the mechanism that seems to be pushing all of this is actually the relationships that rest between these elements. And so, when we take a storytelling, sort of ethos to heart, we're talking about that sort of that middle, that area that we don't really have great vocabulary for. We can't name it this or that. We actually have to go, well, these two things are connected to these hundreds of things all around them in multitudes of ways. And I think stories do a better job at approximating that than a white paper. I came across a poem early on in this work that there was a line that said the universe is made of stories and not of atoms. I really appreciated that. I was growing up too in a time where I just remember the scientific studies that came out every week, and it was like, eggs are bad for you, and now they're good for you, and now like this is bad for you, and you got to stop having this kind of fat, but this fat is okay. And I'm like, if we don't truly understand the methodologies behind all those scientific studies, and it's not incumbent on all of us to do that, we can't all sit around and read all of these white papers and understand where the biases were and where the issues were and how they were carried out or not. And also, if we're not very clear on the fact that like these studies are finite, meaning they use a certain amount of people, and are those people like me, or how am I different? So yes, we need to draw some conclusions from those, but we also need to feel some of these things for ourselves. And I think that storytelling is a really powerful methodology to be able to get some of those concepts across, that we can't always perfectly articulate, that our language has its limitations in discussing ecology. And we come to find out actually that, because particularly, indigenous cultures really try to, or don't try, they really hold this connectivity as sacrosanct, and oftentimes everything is living, not just the biologically living, but the rock is living and the mountain is living. And they've developed language that better encapsulates sometimes this ecological connectivity. And so it's actually easier in some ways to understand where this connectivity, makes sense for us, and the fact that we reside within that we're not separate from it. And so these are, in a way, I'm explaining some things that have been profound for me personally on this journey, as coming from not a scientific background, coming from not an indigenous background, certainly, but how profound these lessons have been for me, and I think how apt they are for all of us, that there's something in here for all of us to engage with and get curious about.
Definitely. The indigenous wisdom is a prime example of storytelling at its best. It's the stories are how you impart the wisdom to each other, as opposed to, relying on scientific studies and research projects and things like that. I think that your model pretty much mirrors that almost exactly.
Definitely. Whether it wasn't fully by strategy, I sometimes feel like we sort of fell backwards into it. But it was so clear that people were ready to hear this, and when presented in the right way, I really saw an opportunity to develop an impact organization that works a little bit differently. And by and large, in the impact space and philanthropy, storytelling, marketing, this sort of softer science, the subjective science of persuasion, these are not always valued. There's certainly funders and the general public who do value those things, but by and large, when you're applying for grants and big foundations, they're wanting to see sort of scientific white papers. They're wanting to see really direct impact. This dollar, regenerates this many acres of land or whatever, and it's just more nuanced than that. And in order to hold that nuance, we had to figure out something that could carry it in that way and honor it. And we didn't want to do it in a way that wasn't transparent, but we're constantly looking for ways to speak to the impact of storytelling. And one of those things, how one of the examples I like to use is, if you've ever been touched deeply by a story, and this could be through a relationship in real life, it could be through a film. If that story changes your life, if that story changes the trajectory of the work that you do or the way that you move about the world, that is immeasurable impact. What happens when we are able to inspire all of the potential of a human being to change their behavior or to change their work in such a way that it is in service to this new cause? And it's really hard to measure that. It's really hard to measure the outcomes or the consequences of inspiration. But I truly believe that's what we're doing, because I've had so many thousands of hours of conversation with people who have been touched by these stories and who have decided to make a change in their life, big or small. Actually, it's not about going back to school and becoming a soil scientist so that you can contribute. You can contribute just by holding some of these tenets in your head, and you're going to make a million more micro decisions with these ideas in mind. This idea that we are connected to everything, and that nothing that I do is within a vacuum. That because I'm connected to everything else, that everything I do actually has very profound consequences on everything else. And just that sense of awareness, I think, is really powerful, but very, very difficult to measure. So yes, I think all of the science and the debate and the nonprofits that are doing the very direct on the ground work, and the nonprofits that are doing the scientific research, it's all critical. It all needs to be there. And we also need some vectors that tie these ideas together in nuanced ways, through art, through prose, through vocabulary, and also just through helping develop the hearts and minds of everyone to be turned on to these concepts. So that's why I say I really do believe everyone has a role to play, and it just starts by getting curious and allowing yourself to fall into that change.
Definitely. And with the sort of layperson's level of understanding and seeing the human stories, it really makes it relatable for even on the consumer level. You know, like you said, you don't have to be a soil scientist to make a difference. I always say that every dollar you spend is a vote for the future you'd like to see.
Mm-hmm.
Being educated in the kinds of things that you're talking about, you know, do you want to spend your dollar on a box of cornflakes that's been spray treated with Roundup, or do you want to spend it at a local farmer's market supporting a small farmer, you know, doing regenerative agriculture in your community?
Right.
You want your food to be trucked halfway around the world with a huge carbon footprint, or made locally and in a way that you're supporting people that you know or are going to see on the street in your town and around your home.
Yeah, it's so true. And I also like to caveat that by saying regeneration is a journey, that it likely actually is without destination. It is only a journey. We are only in constant relationship, and that system is constantly evolving. There's no sort of endpoint. Now, we've created some proxies for endpoints, things like organic certification and the regenerative organic certification. And to some, that sort of feels like, well, I've achieved it. We know that those are only snapshots in time, that we're dealing with living systems that are very dynamic, and that they take constant tending and stewardship to that relationship. And so, you know, the other half of that I want to mention is, this is not just about buying, you know, the most expensive, you know, supposedly cleanest, most beautiful organic produce. It's also about supporting change at every level. And we decided early on that we would have this ethos of progress over perfection. And that really comes out of our desire to inspire empathy through the stories that we tell, empathy for a journey that we are all on. And sometimes that means telling a story about a farmer that has only reduced glyphosate use on their farm by maybe on a portion of their farm, and maybe they've only reduced it by a percentage point or two. Maybe it's a small change. We want to celebrate that. We want to celebrate that person taking a first step. And it's not just the farmer, it's the brands too. Let's not go to the farmer's market and demand this sort of Patagonia levels of perfection of like, well, or the clothing that we buy, or any product that we buy. Oh, I'm not going to buy that product because it comes, there's some plastic in it. Let's push for small changes because we need to create empathy for that journey. And I say the same things to brands and farmers. And we try to hold that ethos very delicately when we're speaking to, someone maybe who's brand new to looking at the ramifications of the food system. You're not doing anything wrong today, but you do have an opportunity to do something better tomorrow. And that just comes with deeper awareness. And I think also cultivating a healthy sense of curiosity about how we engage with the world around us. And so I always push that too. You don't have to just buy the brands that are perfect. You need to try to support a change, a positive change. And that might not be fast enough for you all the time. And it's why, we have some of the groups in the space only want to showcase the sort of light at the top of the hill, the beacons of regeneration, these folks who have these very diversified, incredible operations. And I point, these are great sort of inspirations to look up to. And I point to things like Biggest Little Farm. What an incredible operation that they've built. But just know that represents sort of the 0.1% of where farming is at, and that it's very difficult to get there, and it takes time, and it takes money and creativity. And so how do we want to raise that tide for everyone? And storytelling is one of the ways that we can do that. We can bring farmers closer together with the eater at the other end of the supply chain. And that's what we've seen some of the most successful farms like an Apricot Lane do really well. They've created a brand and an identity about their farm, and they literally made a movie about that journey from zero to where they are today. And so there's just a lot of power in seeing someone committed to build in public like that, and committed to build in relationship with their community that they're feeding. And so, we try to build capacity in farmers also to tell their own story, not just to have to be featured by Farmers Footprint.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that there's that tendency to, if it's not perfect, to shoot holes in why the approach isn't 100%. And if we sit around waiting for perfect, we'll never get anywhere. So I love the idea of celebrating those incremental steps, and also, the inclusive nature, and making sure that we're not vilifying anybody who hasn't taken those steps yet, or isn't taking them fast enough, what we perceive where they need to be going faster or whatever, because farmers have a tough road. They're right now, the amount of profit per acre is like insanely low, and the threats are everywhere. A bad weather season or whatever could everybody's like one bad season away from losing the farm. So they're all under a lot of stress, and we need to appreciate that and hold that as we're in conversation with people, and understand where they've been, where they're going, and what they're up against. And those changes aren't always as easy as they sound.
Absolutely. We need to understand that this multi-trillion-dollar industrial agriculture and food system touches every piece of the economy. It's heavily political. We've got a farm bill coming up here. And this is some of the biggest legislation that Congress touches, period. We have insurance schemes, crop insurance and things like that very clearly, if you want to take advantage of those schemes, you have to grow certain crops in a certain way. Those are big barriers to changing the status quo. We have really powerful agribusinesses and chemical companies, right? These are some of the biggest companies in the world. It's Koch Industries, it's Dow, DuPont, it's Monsanto or Bayer, as it is now. And so there's a lot at stake to, for some of the incumbents to maintain that system. And we also understand that farmers, they learn these production techniques as modern agriculture production in ag schools, at universities. This is what they're taught. And in some cases, it's been several generations since a farmer might have done things in what we would now call a more regenerative way, before those chemicals were actually available to do what they do now. So, I'm not saying that the farmer is purely the victim, but we do have to understand there's a lot of circumstances swirling around this industry that point it in a particular direction, and it can be very difficult and terrifying, frankly, to make changes to that system. And so, even earlier on, 5-10 years ago, when just sort of the first modern sort of regenerative farming started to take place, the first converts to that were often folks that faced existential collapse on their farm, and they just had no other choice but to try something different, because the input costs had risen. They had to put so much fertilizer, increasing amounts of chemistry on the land in order to get the same yield. And this is just squeezing profit margins on these farms to the point where it's not sustainable or a solvent business anymore. And so, and farms do go out of business. Families lost farms, right? A few that were able to make the transition, are now doing great. And some of those folks are some of the leading voices in this movement. But all of them have really powerful, most all of them have very powerful stories to tell about, the courage that it took, the ostracization that they've faced in their communities for doing these changes. We don't talk about the social element as much, but these small agrarian communities, you start farming a different way, and it pisses people off, frankly. And so you'll have your neighbors sitting over the fence wondering what this cover crop is, and why you're not tilling your field, and why your sprayer has been sitting in the barn not being used. That's concerning, and you might not get spoken to at the coffee shop or at church that week. Mm-hmm. And so that's very real, that social stigma that comes from changing your farming practices. We have to understand, especially us non-farmers or folks that don't have a lot of connectivity to agrarian communities, how much, a farmer's identity is wrapped up in the way she stewards her land. And that was something also, that was a learning curve for me also, as a sort of outsider to this community, but something we had to very deeply understand in order to tell effective stories and authentic stories about what was going on.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes out of basically fear of the way you're taught you need to use these chemicals on your land. And if your neighbor's not, maybe they're about to unleash something, start growing something by accident that's going to get across the line into my land. And, whether it's pests or whatever, a mold of some sort. And, it may or may not be totally based in reality, but that's, part of that stigma that's there. And stigma kind of gets me thinking about, you're talking about, it's almost like the farms have become chemically dependent. Well, not almost, the farms have become chemically dependent, and we're, it's very similar to human dependence on chemicals. And it's a similar story where you're getting to a point where you almost have to hit rock bottom before you have that moment of realization that it's time you need to make a change. Or else you just keep plodding along using the same old processes as ever. And I like the idea of helping to tell this story of people who've made that change to hopefully catch people who aren't at that last last straw, waiting to have the foreclosure happen before they finally decide it's time to jump in and make that change.
It's such a key problem for us to figure out, Scott, is this moment of intervention and the way that it can happen sooner, proactively, as opposed to once we've hit rock bottom, because it obviously becomes much more difficult and painful at that point. And so in terms of, my work and my team's work is often in, what are the metaphors that are going to help to push this across? And in that stigma, there's also opportunities. And so there's signals that we may not always expect or not always obvious, but things like, when that farmer down the street who started cover cropping 5 years ago, well, she just bought a new truck. I saw that bright, shiny new truck in the driveway. Something must be happening over there. Something good must be going on if they're doing well. And so it's also these things, we sort of call them Trojan horses, right? Like, what are the ways that we can sort of incept some of these benefits and align some incentives for these farmers, and also for consumers, frankly. Like, if you don't care about soil health, well, you do care about human health, or almost everyone knows someone in their family or friend who's been affected by cancer or autism, or some of these chronic diseases that have exploded that Zach speaks so eloquently to. We're increasingly finding these linkages. So fine, you don't have to care about soil science, but understand that the microbiome in that soil and the gut microbiome and you and your family are very much related, and they very much care about one another, even if we don't understand or can articulate all the ways in which they do. And so those are some of the, a lot of folks who step into this space for the first time don't do it even necessarily out of like maybe you don't care about climate change. We know that regenerative agriculture has some very promising components as for climate change and carbon sequestration and the like. But again, we need to tell the right story to the right person for that to land for them. And for many, it's human health. This is something that we can all get behind and that we should all care about, even if we don't care about the other stuff. To the farmers, certainly they're subject to caring about human health as well, but we can talk to them about farm profitability, economic viability. We can tell a story about that to them. And so, it's about, we're able to modulate with these stories what we can share with folks that's going to be most relevant to them. And that's something else I think we've done a very good job with is we have very sophisticated folks that develop these storytelling and content strategies to make sure that you're hearing the message that is going to be most impactful for you. And that sort of changes things from a spray and pray kind of type of media where, hey, this story is interesting to us, maybe it'll be interesting to everyone, to, hey, we can start to get really sharp on what's going to be most impactful for this group of people to hear right now. And really, to be fair, those are the same methodologies that are being used to sell us on all the crap that we don't need. And we want to put those same methodologies to work in service for the planet. And so that's a big part of what undergirds our strategy as well. And the people that work at Farmers Footprint with me are those folks. They're creative professionals, they're performance digital marketers. Like, built a team of folks that are not necessarily nonprofit folks, actually have very little core sort of nonprofit industry folks that are on the team. These are all folks from other sectors that are taking the learnings and applying it to this very difficult problem that we have. And as a result, these stories start to become a top of the funnel for human expertise to come down into this space. And so while we may not take you down the rabbit hole yourself, we will start to point out where the rabbit holes are, and we can figure out what's really interesting and applicable to you. And I am so deeply convinced that we need expertise from outside of agriculture to get involved in this in order for us to solve the problems that we're facing. We need entrepreneurs, we need creative professionals, we need investment professionals, we need technologists. We need all of your expertise that's out there in your audience too, Scott. We need them to get inspired by what's happening here, and then find the pathway that ties the solution to their expertise. And I guarantee you that we need it. You don't have to be a farmer to make a change in this place. Some people do find their route that way, but I'm telling you, these systems touch all of these other sectors of the economy, and we better take the learnings and expertise there and apply it, or we're going to miss a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to need to address.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and a multi-trillion-dollar industry is not about digging holes in the ground and putting seeds in them alone. Obviously, that's a big piece of what needs to happen, but it's also a business. So there is marketing and economics and financing and everything else that you mentioned. And I also like the idea of, the stories need to be different. There are stories that are going to motivate farmers that are not going to motivate a consumer, because they get into the weeds, no pun intended, of the nuts and bolts of making the farm happen. Those kinds of stories are important to motivate a farmer to take action, but they're different stories than the ones that are going to motivate a consumer or an investor or somebody else to take action.
Yes.
And so many audiences and so many stories, it's like an overwhelming task if you look at it as a whole. And I know that the farmers can't just sit around and wait for Farmers Footprint to come and tell their story. And one of the things that I really appreciate is the approach that you all are taking to sort of democratize that storytelling experience with the Nest operation. And I was hoping you could expand upon that a little bit for us.
Yeah, we understood that because of the stratification in the food supply chain, we've started to categorize ourselves. Where do I fit in this place? And for farmers, it was, well, I'm the one that digs the hole and puts the seeds in and grows the crop. And then I'm done. Then I'm going to sell that to the distributor or the CPG brand or whatever it is. And that's the end of my place in this. And increasingly as we're understanding the resiliency and actually the profit that is available by staying out of that very long supply chain, commodified supply chain of food, where you're competing, with every country in the planet now, because these supply chains are so huge and complex. To feed a company like General Mills, for instance, that they're sourcing things from all over the world. So that's driving the prices down, right? Of everything is simple supply and demand. And you have cost of production that varies greatly, right? It's just cheaper to grow stuff in the global South, for instance, as opposed to the US. And so, yeah, one of the big things that we're trying to imbue in farmers is like, it's actually important to have a relationship with the person who's ultimately consuming your products to whatever extent you can. And that's only going to happen if you're ready to accept the fact that, you are a business, and that business also needs its form of marketing and brand oftentimes. And this doesn't apply to every type of farming, obviously, but by and large, especially for the smaller regional farms that really serve a critical role in local food systems, they need a way to get their name out there. And so we took sort of an approach, inspired a bit by Amazon, frankly, because what Amazon does really well as a company is they build capacity and capability that they themselves need. And then they realize, well, we've done such a good job building this for ourselves because it needed to run really well. We can actually turn that around and it can be a service for others. And so, things like AWS, Amazon Web Services, that was infrastructure that Amazon built for itself. And it was built to such a high level of performance that they went around and turned that into a product that they offered. And now a lot of the web is run off an AWS server. And so that sort of, I think, is a useful model of what we would call a critical infrastructure to develop. And so if Farmers Footprint is developing a competency to tell farmer stories, but we know that we're functionally limited in being able to touch every farmer, let's turn that capability outward and let's build that capacity in farmers themselves as a service. And so the Nest is really the result of several years of developing these farmer stories, understanding and working with these farmers closely, understanding where their gaps of understanding and expertise really lie in marketing, and starting to build a program around developing that capacity in them. And in some ways, we're sort of a creative agency for farmers. And that's something we've been really excited to start to bring out. And it's, the impact, even just from a farmer, of seeing a story told about them or told by them, even seeing portraiture of them, when you're working in the field, like, a lot of these farmers never even had websites. They've certainly never seen pictures of, beautiful, market ready sort of pictures of them or the produce that they're growing. It just wasn't highly valued. But increasingly, as people are having to discover and develop relationships with these farmers, that's what we're used to. We're used to seeking these things out and interacting with them on websites and on social media. And there's a desire by the consumer to make these connections. And so, the Nest actually started we stumbled on it sort of on accident. We were doing a farmer story with a woman named Maria Catalan in California in the Central Valley. And she had this beautiful organic farm that she was developing, and she sort of had this CSA. She doesn't speak English. She's from Mexico, and she had family members helping her communicate with the community to provide these CSA boxes, essentially, that she was doing. And it was all done over text. It was very sporadic and difficult to manage, and she didn't even have a website for people to sort of get in touch and engage. And so we saw that we were just going to do a story on her, and then we realized, like, well, if we do this story, there's nowhere for people to sort of go and then get in touch with her afterward. And so, just out of necessity, we spun up a website. We designed her a logo. We helped her build out a sort of order management system for her CSA boxes. And it's still going and thriving, and it was a beautiful job. And she just the gratitude and then the increased capability for her to serve and feed her community was just so rewarding. And so, yeah, we've kind of turned that into a formal program called the Nest, and we'd like to continue building that out and interacting. Frankly, one of the beautiful things about it was, we can't do all of this work in-house. We're a small team. So we reached out to our audience and said, where are the creators out there that want to help farmers do that? And we've got hundreds of replies. So we have this now sort of marketplace in the making, where we have a whole bunch of farmers who are needing these services and a whole bunch of independent creative professionals who are really excited to start to do some of this work. And so the work ahead of us now is, how do we develop, that matchmaking mechanism and let these relationships move further along?
It's really great. It's, taking the storytelling up to the next level and helping people to decide what kind of story they want to tell about themselves. And then also providing them some of the tools to help them make them more successful. Because in any production chain, do you want to be the person who's just mining the raw materials, or would you like to add value along the way and get a bigger piece of that pie that's, up the food chain a little bit, if you will? The people are making much more profit on the raw materials that somebody else produces. So if you can help get people to get a longer segment of that chain all in the same place, they're going to have a much more lucrative experience rather than just selling bushels like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and it's not even just about more profit. It's actually becoming an economic imperative, because the percentage of each dollar that a consumer spends on a food product that ends up in the farmer's hand has shrank and shrank and shrank and shrank over the last several decades. And that's because they've gotten further and further away from that end consumer and that piece of value add. And so, yeah, the closer you can get to that, the higher portion of that food dollar that you can capture, that's actually what's going to change your entire operation. And again, we're talking about specific types of farms that produce that sort of. We haven't even touched, the 40-50% of farms that are growing stuff for, growing corn for ethanol.
Right.
It's not food, or growing food for cattle. So not even for human consumption. So, yeah, it's a big, wily world, but I think it's helpful and easier to understand when we first just talk about, hey, this is food that we're producing for humans.
Right. So I know we're running to the end of our time here. I wanted to ask, what can our listeners do to help you be more successful?
Yeah, so the first thing that I usually offer is decide to get curious about your food system. Decide to start to ask questions when you go into the grocery store, and if you have the opportunity to go and go to a farmer's market, or even look up if there's farms in your area, to go and start developing a relationship with a farmer. And even better, go and put your hands in some soil. Go volunteer at a farm. Go start a garden, because that really is, it doesn't sound like a big thing, but it really is the first step to starting to really embody some of the lessons that are there for you. And I think it opens up a world of possibility as we start to take those lessons and those experiences on land, and superimpose them over our lived experiences and our expertise. That's what I would call this moment where you are now primed to really make a difference. So I always start there. And then I'd like you to get in touch with us. And I'd like you to share with us what realizations you've come to. And one thing that I really have the pleasure of doing each and every week is I spend time speaking with folks in our audience, folks who have engaged our content and are coming to me with these thoughts. And from there, I know that doesn't seem scalable, but there's resources now we can start to point you to take that next step down the rabbit hole. If you want to figure out, you come from a financial background and you want to talk about the economics of farming, what the investment funds in this space are doing, or how we need to retool sort of our investment models to account for these regenerative systems, I've got people for you to talk to. I've got resources for you. If you want to think about CPG brands and the business of food, I've got people that would want to hear from you, and I've got places where you can engage with that. If you just want to be in community with folks who are thinking about these same things, you may not have an idea even after you've been volunteering for a year on a farm and getting a lot out of it, you still may be lost at where's the change that I'm supposed to make here. Come join our community. We've got 8,000 people in our Farmers Footprint community right now, that it's bubbling with ideas and ways to get involved and apply this to your everyday life and in your community.
On your farmersfootprint.us website, with the community page is set up on there, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's we use a tool called Mighty Network, and we have an amazing team. You'll see a lot of Inez, who's our community manager there, who is incredibly knowledgeable about all the different nooks and crannies of this space, and she will help steward and point you in the next direction, or connect you with 10 other people that are having similar thoughts as you. Find community in this first, because out of that, and here's that metaphor coming back, there's this idea or there's this phenomenon called quorum sensing. And quorum sensing is a description of what a community of microbiology do when they hit a certain level of diversity. When you have enough different diverse species in a community, you start to get these emergent behaviors that no single entity in that community is supposed to have on paper. You get these extra sort of superpowers. And I want to encourage everyone to be a part of that. The more diversity of lived experience, competency, and insight we can get within that community, the more incredible the outcomes start to become, and unexpected things begin to happen. And so we have projects starting up in there. We have businesses starting. We have new nonprofits that people are dreaming up. We have community organizing happening there, and we just have a lot of ideas being exchanged that we're not seeded in any way. They are just emerging. And so those are some tangible things right away, like come in and join us and get into the conversation, bring your curiosity and bring your openness and bring your stupid questions. I'll be the first to admit that, that first year I start all my conversations with the fact I'm not a farmer, and I'm going to ask all the stupid questions here, and be okay with that. Be okay. Well,
somebody's got to do it.
Someone's got to do it, and it's not my tendency either, but you don't have a choice. You're going into this space where you feel passionately about it. You understand that there's something very important here, but if you just don't know, you got to be willing to ask, and you got to be willing to listen. So those are some of the ways we have we've been working on this emerging campaign specifically around glyphosate. We think that there is quite a big opportunity politically and just culturally for us to put a nail in the coffin in glyphosate. We have the scientific background. We're partnering with Center for Food Safety, which is one of the leading nonprofit groups that is a legal and legislative group. They're actually, in the courts with Monsanto and with the EPA, putting the fire to the feet there and getting the laws on the books, and also the existing sort of regulations to make sure that they're followed. And so we're sort of bringing the sizzle of storytelling, and they're bringing all the legal expertise. And we really want to build a national campaign and perhaps a global movement to get glyphosate out of our food system for good. And so, yeah, there's opportunities to join that effort. We've got a petition on change.org to ban the use of glyphosate as a desiccant. And we've got Senator Cory Booker leaned into that effort, and a bunch of other really impressive folks from across politics and agribusiness who are alongside us. So join us in that, get involved in that. And go out and find some of, like, we work on the macro scale, Scott, like we're often sitting across in these big, larger narratives and how we craft that and bringing a lot of folks in. But as I mentioned, there's a whole mosaic of community groups, nonprofits, state and city governments, that with great people that are doing this aligned work. Go find those folks in your community and connect with them. And, you can bring all of our content into that to help get those through the door if it's helpful, or if there's any other way that we can help support those efforts. I want to encourage people to do that too, because those are the folks that are actually putting some of this directly onto the ground. And in some ways we can just be a catalyst for that at a high level. We need to really understand that there's a whole spectrum in between, from the global narratives and the big audiences straight down to, the community food fridges and the local distribution and connection of farmers and starting a farm stand in your community. Whatever it is, there's going to be those opportunities where I guarantee you have an opportunity to make a difference there.
That's great. Yeah, I always think back to some friends of mine who were teaching a drawdown course at a library near me, and they basically asked everybody in the audience to find a topic they were interested in and passionate about, and then think about the level that you feel comfortable making a difference at. Is it your family, your neighborhood, your town, state, global, whatever it is? You make a difference with one person, and that everything moves us all forward.
There's so much agency in that, and I really want to inspire that sense of agency. I think the macro narratives on climate change and the food system, and they feel so big. They feel big to me, and I work in some of the echelons of that space. What can you do today inside your own home?
Right.
Start there. And you're probably already doing it, frankly. Like you're making considered decisions when you're deciding what to feed your child, hopefully how you're tending your yard. Please stop buying Roundup and those weed killers and spraying that around your property. Like get down into the dirt if you can, and pull some weeds. And that in itself will be a revolutionary act. And it's okay. Like I'll give you all of my kudos for that alongside anything else.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time today. This has been great, and really looking forward to sharing it with the community. And just want to take a minute and give thanks to everybody that's listening and doing their part to make a difference. Also, a shout out to my partner at Sustainability Now, Mira Rubin, and just want to remind people that this is everything we do is making a difference, and working together we can shape a world that works.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.